Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Ohanyan, a professor of political science and international relations at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Together, we will talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and the consequences that it will have on Armenia. She also wrote, by the way, her fifth book, which is The Neighborhood Effect, The Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Eurasia, forthcoming with Stanford University Press in August 2022. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Ohanyan.
It's a pleasure.
So it's been over a week, as I said, that the war between Russia and Ukraine is ongoing. In your opinion, what would be the next stage of the conflict, considering that many analysts believe that Kiev will be surrounded within the next few days?
There has been, let me just start by saying that there have been concurrent efforts, diplomatic efforts, on the side of the United States, the European leaders, and of course other countries, Turkey, Israel, have been offering their services, or they're willing to negotiate a settlement. But this war, the way the dynamics is unfolding, a diplomatic off-ramp remains elusive. This is a war of conquest, and this is as such. These types of wars actually have been declining in the world, and they have become partly because they have little political efficacy in delivering goals for the countries, parties that start these types of wars. So for the Kremlin, for President Putin, there is very little in terms of looking for, in terms of having an exit. His signature so far has been to escalate. If this continues this way without an agreement, it is headed towards a proxy war. Counterinsurgency inside Ukraine will be building. The West, various NATO countries seem to be willing to provide arms to Ukraine without NATO response. There are protests in places where Russian troops enter. So and even if there is a diplomatic off-ramp, I think this war already militarized Russia, Europe front line, and it is not going to improve dramatically. So there needs to be a short-term, immediate solution of ending the crisis. But again, and then the long-term thinking as to how to provide for security for states that are out of NATO, but they are in these frontline regions. And the domestic impact for Russia is also going to be significant. I'm just really shocked. This was such a huge miscalculation on the side of the Kremlin. Moscow abrogated its institutional role that it was playing in Eurasian security conversations. So I think Russia has a lot to lose with this war, even if it succeeds in weakening Ukraine militarily, economically, perhaps splitting it. All the scenarios, when you consider, in none of these scenarios, Russia emerges as a state victorious.
Mm-hmm. So there has been, you talked about the diplomatic mistakes, but there have been talks on and off between the two sides, and also offers to mediate by Israel, Turkey, China, and other European countries. And when observing the diplomatic events, where do you think these talks will lead?
On the surface, I think some of the diplomacy, even including the ones the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, that were supposedly designed to at least to create a humanitarian corridor for Ukraine, that creates some sort of a ceasefire. So it just has not been working. So in the short term, I think you're going to see, in my assessment, performative diplomacy, but I don't think Putin is ready to de-escalate. Again, he needs a victory, which is not, nobody's going to win from this war, but he needs something big to claim victory to domestic audiences. So how far the West is willing to go, and I'm actually also thinking whether Putin's use of military, political, whatever term he's using to describe this war and invasion, is a way to live his own, kind of give himself some ambiguity and to say, okay, kind of when he's ready to say, okay, I won because I succeeded to, I don't know, I demolished military infrastructure in Ukraine. So I wonder whether that is designed to be ambiguous in order to give him a face-saving option to de-escalate. I might be optimistic on this. Right now, he just does not have a way to de-escalate because domestically his support is really will be declining. Economic response has been overwhelming. So in a short term, the only actor that can have, in my view, moderating influence is probably China. As to whether China will be willing to use its role in constraining Russia is really a big question.
The Kremlin is arguing that NATO expansion is a threat to Russia, and the Western powers gave guarantees after the Cold War that it will not expand into the post-Soviet space. So do you think that this argument of the Russian side is a fair point? And doesn't that show that maybe the West has also a responsibility on what's going on now?
If you ask me, if we had this interview before this invasion in Ukraine, my answer would be slightly different. On the one hand, yes, I think the Kremlin has been, and even before Putin, has been always signaling that NATO expansion is threatening for Russia. But at the same time, and my approach, my criticism of NATO actually has been that it has, by engaging in expansionism and actually not giving, not even at the same time stating that Ukraine and Georgia are not going to be members anytime soon, NATO has created a moral hazard, a risk for the states when it comes to their security. So in addition to this, that Turkey relationships right after military relationship was building up. So there are some very real, perhaps perceived sense of insecurity on the side of Russia. But at the same time, I think looking to what Putin has achieved, it's really looks like Putin ended up strengthening NATO for years to come, militarized the Western relations with Ukraine, the very objective that President Putin has been stating that it has been trying to avoid. So that's one way to look at the question. In addition, the drivers of this type of a war are complex. I don't think NATO expansion can be the only or even the primary reason for this. The West miscalculated, absolutely, but not for the reason that Putin is claiming, not necessarily. So the this is a very anti-systemic war, and the drivers of these types of wars are very different. They're not a single argument can be explained. Domestic factors also need to be factored in. There's something specific about Ukraine that was driving Russia's behavior, and also the fact, I think Putin's imperial speech right before the invasion lays it out plainly that it is way more than only about NATO. It probably sent jitters all over to Central Asia, which has a very similar demographic structure. Well, not completely similar, but it is a state that so-called is a stakeholder of Soviet ethno-federalism, which Putin mentioned that Russia is entitled to all of this lands on which all these post-Soviet states are created. And Kazakhstan also has a Russian minority. So I think it is way more than about NATO at this point. If it was not for this war, that argument would have a stronger footing, but not now. And again, I think the NATO policy has been to create moral hazard, as opposed to, and by that I mean that NATO de-incentivized the state to look for building regional security orders, as opposed to looking at distant capitals in providing security for their states.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this invasion has united the West?
Absolutely, and not just the West. I think because this is a war of conquest because it's an intervention, a use of force to bulldozing through an existing peace process. It's a war that challenges the norm of territorial integrity. It is expansionist. All of these things are at the heart of the international rules-based world order. No, it's not just Europe that is a stakeholder for these values, but the rest of the world. I would only add that the international community is much weaker in protecting, in standing up for the norm of peaceful resolution of conflicts than it is for territorial integrity. But still, I think with this war, it sent jitters all over the world, and it did unite Europe and tied United States much more strongly to NATO. Now NATO is militarizing. NATO was an institution that was struggling to find its footing in an increasingly multipolar Eurasia. So yes, it united Europe, and you could actually see in terms of the types of sanctions that are applied on Russia. And at this point, actually, these are not looking sanctions anymore. This looks like more economic containment of Russia, much broader, which will need to necessitate a huge economic rethink, not only in Armenia, but also all of the post-Soviet states moving forward.
Let's talk about Armenia. As a consequence of the Russian invasion, the West has imposed heavy sanctions on Russia. How would you assess the impact on Armenia, considering that the high-level integration between Armenian and Russian economies? How do you think it will affect Armenia?
I have been following the reports by various economists in Armenia as well as globally. So I think my assessment in that respect probably will not add a lot. Very simply, I think the fact, the supply chains, food prices, inflation, the value of remittances coming from Russia to Armenia, all of those definitely will play a role. So in a short term, Armenia, as any other country in most countries in the world, will have these effects. But in a short term, I think the risks are a lot more long term because, as I mentioned, this is an economic containment policy, meaning that this is because the sanctions are so overwhelming, they amount to really crippling Russian economy in order to eliminate its capacity to wage war. And so far, it's pretty unprecedented for this type of economic policy to be applied on this. Russia is not an economic powerhouse, but it is significant. It is significant in terms of size of its population, territory, resources that it possesses. So we cannot look at US sanctions on Iran and draw conclusions. This is pretty unprecedented. And in that respect, I think understanding what Armenia's economic policy is going to be if Russia is going to remain under this extensive economic containment policy, that is the question I think our economists need to be thinking about. Actually, it's not just economists. Political science has a huge role to play as well. So it's a very complicated problem, and not just Armenia will be thinking about this, but all of the countries in Russia's vicinity.
Well, thank you, Anna, for this talk.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for watching.
I wish the circumstances were different, though.
Yeah. Well, anyways, maybe one day. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.